What's going on, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back to review Justice League Dark Apokolips War, a movie that wasn't even on my radar until a couple days ago, and it absolutely blew my mind. I'm in an absolutely fantastic mood right now. Admittedly, I just had a Red Bull like 20 minutes ago, and it's starting to kick in. And not to worry, I will keep this review spoiler-free initially, but some of the scenes in this movie were so damn cool that I won't be able to resist talking about them in full before the end of the review. But in a year that's destined to go down in history as one of the strangest years in movie history, there's a very good chance that this might end up being the best superhero movie of 2020. The best way I can describe it is that this is DC Comics on steroids. It's R-rated, but even more important than the R rating is the fact that this is the 15th and final film in a series of movies where all the continuity and status quo is about to be reset, which means that there were basically no rules that couldn't be broken with this. Every crazy apocalyptic scenario you could possibly imagine involving the most iconic DC characters, this movie basically gets a chance to explore them to the full. And comic books historically have had these opportunities on many occasions. You can always say something's in the Elseworlds or what if, or you can reset the continuity. But when it comes to movies, the ships tend to move much slower, and it's much more difficult to course correct. And because these franchises are so enormously valuable, which leads to a scenario where filmmakers are discouraged from taking massive chances with characters that have enormous long-term value for the various studios that control the intellectual property. But if you're wondering what the hell this movie is all about, it is the direct sequel to Justice League Dark from 2017. And it's kind of a loose adaptation of the Darkseid War, which took place in the comics in 2015 and 2016. But calling it an adaptation is kind of stretching that word to the breaking point. It basically picks and chooses certain ingredients and details from that 11-issue arc, and then crafts a brand new story that makes sense for this animated continuity. And I should also admit, I don't necessarily watch each and every single DC animated movie that comes out from Warner Brothers Animation, but when the movies are exploring characters or scenarios that I find irresistible, then I always give them a shot. But I think this might be my favorite DC animated movie, probably since the days of Bruce Timm's Justice League Unlimited back in the early 2000s. And my biggest takeaway from this movie is that Jack Kirby, the king of comics, he quite literally is the gift that keeps on giving, because so much of what makes this movie interesting goes directly back to his creations when he was working at DC in the early 70s, when he created Darkseid and the New Gods and New Genesis and Apokolips. And if you want to see what I'm talking about, Jack Kirby's comic New Gods #7, I still maintain is one of the best standalone issues of any comic ever written or drawn. These worlds and characters are so fascinating and so iconic and have so much incredible dramatic potential. And this movie gives us something that we will probably never see in the world of live action, where all the heroes of Earth quite literally go to war with all the forces of Darkseid and straight up lose and lose badly in the first couple minutes of the movie. The rest of the movie is this wild post-apocalyptic scenario where the few remaining survivors have to try and pick up the pieces and make one final last-ditch effort to set things right. And if you're a fan of John Constantine, then this is the movie for you, because he is front and center. And while I might argue that this movie overpowers him a tad and basically turns him into something like Doctor Strange, his characterization is right on the money. My favorite arcs dealing with John Constantine are probably Alan Moore's handling the character back in the pages of Swamp Thing, or if you really want to get down and dirty, something like Hard Time by Brian Azzarello. That's one of my all-time favorite comics that I've read from any era. But with this movie, you have a strange scenario where John Constantine is forming alliances with some pretty unlikely individuals in order to try and take down Darkseid once and for all. And that includes some leftovers from the Justice League, a few leftovers from the Suicide Squad, and a few leftovers from the Teen Titans. So if you've ever dreamed of watching a scenario where Damian Wayne and Lex Luthor and Harley Quinn and John Constantine will all find their interests in total alignment, this is probably the one time you're going to get to see that happen. And I realize I've gotten pretty deep into my review without even mentioning who actually created this thing. It was co-directed by Matt Peters and Christina Sada, and it was written by somebody named Marguerite Scott, if I'm saying that correctly. But Marguerite Scott deserves a huge high five, because the story manages to deliver so many incredible beats that are going to make fans of all these characters really happy. This is one of those movies that has dozens of speaking roles and has only got 90 minutes to play with. So obviously not every character is going to get equal screen time, but the key with these movies is to make sure that the villains and the heroes at least have one scene where they look like total badasses, so the fans can give the movie a high five and move on with their lives. And this is one of those movies where I encourage you not to blink, because during these battle scenes, incredibly important historic DC characters just get torn to pieces, quite literally. If you look away from the screen, you might see one of the most important characters in DC history just get torn to smithereens by parademons, or you might miss some moment of incredible heroic personal sacrifice. Fans are going to be picking over the little details of this movie for a very long time with a huge smile on their face. I think it's going to have enormous rewatchability, and I hate to have to even say this as part of my review, but it is a giant concern these days when it comes to the handling of beloved franchises. But this movie was delightfully free of any annoying political commentary or propaganda. Because for me, really great storytelling, mythic storytelling, tales of high adventure, they transcend partisan politics to the point where they start to explore universal themes that apply to everybody, no matter what their beliefs or ideology might be. Because when you're facing a scenario that is an existential threat to the entire universe, guess what? All the little partisan concerns start to feel pretty trivial by comparison. So I think this is one of those movies that will appeal to pretty much any fan of DC Comics. Whether they're 12 years old or 72 years old, there is quite literally something in this for everybody. And probably my favorite bit about this movie, and this is going to make me sound like a big baby, but I got waves of chills on multiple occasions throughout the movie. There are dramatic scenes and heroic scenes where if you're a fan of these characters, you would just feel chills and goosebumps going right at the back of your neck. And I couldn't believe that this 90-minute cartoon managed to insert so many of those cool scenes into such a tight running time. On the other hand, you have some live-action superhero movies these days where they struggle to come up with one decent scene in an entire 2-hour running time. If I were to criticize this movie at all, it would be that in the middle of the movie, it kind of slows down, takes a breath, the characters regroup, they start strategizing and plotting and basically setting the stage for the latter part of the movie. But it begins in incredible fashion and it ends in incredible fashion. And as soon as I'm done posting this review, I'm going to pop it right back in and watch it all over again. So I think all the animators involved with this movie should absolutely take a bow. Warner Brothers Animation can basically do whatever they want with these characters moving forward, and they're going to have a very tough act to follow. And the people who are going to have an even tougher act to follow are the people involved in the live-action Justice League Dark show that recently got announced as part of HBO Max. J.J. Abrams is going to be one of the producers. Because the Justice League Dark characters are not necessarily beloved across the globe the way that Batman and Superman and Wonder Woman are. But for hardcore comic book fans, characters like Zatanna and Swamp Thing and John Constantine and Etrigan and Deadman. These are some of the coolest characters in the history of DC Comics. And it was cool seeing how these characters got to take center stage in a lot of ways as this giant series of movies draws to a close. But that's as far as I can go without calling attention to a few spoilers. So bail out now if you don't want to hear me discuss any major details, but I have to give a quick shout out to some of my favorite scenes of this movie. So first and foremost, the R rating, that was awesome. It allows dialogue and action beats that you would never see otherwise in most Warner Brothers live action movies. Hearing John Constantine referring to Batman cock blocking him, or seeing Raven say things like, "for fuck's sake," before casting a spell, it was just delightful because ordinarily, not even in the comics do you get exposed to that sort of dialogue. And when it comes to the action, I couldn't believe just how far this movie took it. There's one scene where Batgirl's taking on a bunch of parademons when suddenly they just dogpile on top of her and you just see blood and body parts being thrown in all directions. I was like, holy shit, that was Barbara Gordon, she's gone. And what's incredible is how in the first few minutes of this movie, you have this giant disastrous attack on Apokolips. Whereas it turns out Darkseid knows everything their heroes are up to because Cyborg's eye is feeding them all the information about what they're planning. Which means that most of the major members of the Justice League are either killed, dismembered, brainwashed, or imprisoned before the movie even really gets started. What really upsets the power balance is the fact that Darkseid captures and tortures Superman in such a way where he injects kryptonite into every aspect of his body, rendering him powerless. He stops calling himself Superman. He just goes by Clark, and while he's still got his heroic ideals, he is by far the weakest person out of all the good guys in this movie. But my favorite detail, which was inspired by the comic by Jeff Johns and Jason Fabok, is the fact that Batman is now sitting on Metron's Mobius chair. It's slightly different in this, however, because Darkseid rewires Batman's brain first, so Batman basically becomes the most reliable, resourceful, and brilliant lieutenant in all of Darkseid's forces. And what makes Darkseid so intimidating this time around is the fact that he has these new parademons. He's basically taken Doomsday and Parademons and combined them. The name is ridiculous. They're called Paradooms. I absolutely hated that name, but that might be the only thing I disliked about the movie. But it leads to these crazy scenes, like when you see the Justice League just go down in a matter of minutes. You see Wonder Woman getting an arm torn off, Cyborg getting both of his torn off, Martian Manhunter being burned alive, Aquaman just gets absolutely obliterated. It's just absolutely wild because the DC characters for me have always been these kind of towering pop culture icons, whereas the Marvel characters are a little bit more rooted in reality, at least when it comes to reading the comics. And one does not expect to see your icons so easily dispatched. But all the people who would typically save the day have been taken off the chessboard. I'm a massive fan of Dick Grayson as Nightwing, but early on we see him impaled and killed, and then Damian makes the decision to raise him using the Lazarus pit, but it all goes horribly wrong, and now Dick Grayson's just sitting in a jail cell with this crazy yellow eye. But it's not all doom and gloom. There's a little humor along the way because Harley Quinn is now leading the Suicide Squad. She bemoans the fact that the new version of Batman isn't any fun at all. One of the first things he did was kill the Joker. But one of the scenes that really gave me chills is when Harley Quinn talks about how the Suicide Squad is really earning their name this time around because they're given one of the worst missions of all, of basically holding off an army of parademons from Lex Luthor's building in order to guard a boom tomb that goes to Apokolips, where the heroes are making this last-ditch effort to destroy the planet. But because the parademons have been created with Doomsday DNA, that means they are indirectly Kryptonian, which means that all of Lex Luthor's weapons that involve kryptonite can all be put to use in this giant battle. So you have like King Shark covering his teeth with kryptonite. You have Harley Quinn shooting people with kryptonite guns. You've got Damian Wayne going to war wielding a kryptonite sword. It's insanely cool to watch. Even Clark Kent gets in this giant suit that Lex Luthor's been making, where the goal was to fight Superman, but now it's Clark Kent using a weapon to fight the armies of Apokolips. And much like the original Darkseid War, issues 40 to 50 in Justice League, Lex Luthor is on the side of the good guys in this, but what's cool is that Lex Luthor starts on the good side, switches over and joins forces with Darkseid, but as it turns out, he's a spy working with Lois Lane. Lois Lane is kind of taking on the role of like a general of all the forces, who's marshaling all the remaining good guys on Earth while our heroes go off and fight this war in Apokolips. And then in one of the most sick and twisted parts of the movie, the remaining members of the Justice League are revealed to be these like cyborg hybrids now that are under Darkseid's control, including Wonder Woman. But in one of the best scenes of the movie, Constantine uses her lasso to restore Wonder Woman's free will. So it's now Diana versus Martian Manhunter and Mira and Starfire and Hawkman. It is absolutely a battle royale. And another scene that gave me chills is when Batman's finally freed from Darkseid's influence, and Darkseid tries to destroy him then and there, but Damian jumps in front of his father, takes the blast, and reminds his father, justice, not vengeance. I'm getting chills just remembering that scene, but it's an excellent motto. And because this movie's not worried at all about what's going to happen next because it's a totally blank slate, they were able to go for broke with some crazy scenarios like when Trigon is freed to take on Darkseid one-on-one, leading to a classic scenario where you have an old god versus a new god, and I was just grinning from ear to ear. Or a scene where we see Darkseid take on all of Oa and the Guardians and the Green Lantern Corps, and he just mops the floor with all of them, and right as Jon Stewart looks like he's about to save the day and recharge his ring from the giant battery, Darkseid and evil Batman open up a boom tube and drop part of the Earth's core right on top of the battery, destroying everything in sight, including Jon Stewart. It's just absolutely bananas. So at the end of the movie, with both Apokolips and Darkseid totally destroyed, it appears as if Earth is going to die anyway because so much of its magma core is missing now, it no longer even rotates at the correct speed. And that's when Constantine talks to Flash and talks about what they need is another Flashpoint. It was the Flashpoint that started this continuity in the first place and allowed this 15-movie arc, and it's yet another Flashpoint that's going to allow a rebirth with whatever movies come next. So as an aging fan of comic books and superheroes and comic book movies and that sort of thing, I've grown accustomed to the idea that not every cartoon or movie is going to appeal to me equally. Some of them I'm going to hate outright. So I try just to be patient and focus on franchises and movies that I really enjoy and not worry over each and every single twist and turn of these franchises that I've been following my entire life. But when I get a movie or a show or a comic or whatever that absolutely knocks it out of the park, in my opinion, it just helps me rediscover my love of these characters all over again and why I fell in love with superheroes in the first place, back before I could even read. So as I mentioned before, 2020, it's been a very weird year for movies. When we get to the end of the year, who knows what our top 10 lists are even going to look like. But one thing I can safely say is that we at least got one fantastic superhero movie this year. And it's one that I hope that'll inspire more movies like it moving into the future. But that's all I got to say for now. So I hope you enjoyed this reaction and review. If you did, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell. And if you want to talk more about superheroes, comics, whatever, hunt me down on Twitter at Colbrax. But I can't thank you enough for watching the video. I really appreciate it. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.